Rob Dyrdek was a professional skateboarder turned entrepreneur turned TV star, and now he's literally turned into 60% of what MTV shows in their network, which is $1 billion network on its own. Sometimes Rob Dyrdek, it's all that is being shown in MTV for 3 days in a row. And this is not uncommon at all, because Rob has done some crazy things to take advantage of MTV, because it's not all just plain luck. The truth is that Rob is a genius entrepreneur who has sold multiple businesses for a total over $400 million, and has added some extra slick moves that have made MTV depend on him for years and years. They say life is a journey, but for one man, it's been an extraordinary ride. Get ready to witness the remarkable story of Rob Dyrdek, a visionary entrepreneur skateboarding icon who defied the odds and left an unbelievable mark in the world of action sports. Born on June 28, 1974 in Kettering, Ohio, Rob discovered his love for skateboarding at age 11. He was obsessed with skateboarding, and his obsession and dedication quickly showed in his talent, which propelled him to the top of the ranks in the skateboarding world. He saw his friends invest $26,000 in Alien Workshop, and this would be the first taste he would get at entrepreneurship. At age 16, he moved out of high school and would go to California to pursue his dream. He was just a skateboarder and he was loyal to his team, but it was only natural that after he saw his friends put $26,000 down and start their own business, that he would like to do the same at 16 years old. So he decided to start his very first company called Orion Trunks. The company actually still exists to this day, but Rob is not involved in it in any way, shape, or form. In fact, he actually sold it, but it now goes on to show that his vision is still alive some 20 years later, and it was anything but a business failure. You see, the funny thing is all this has happened when Rob is still not a pro, but that is the next step. So in 1995, Rob Dyrdek, he decided to make the move to go pro, being sponsored by Drawers Clothing. That might not actually sound familiar to you right now, even if you're actually familiar with Rob Dyrdek's life, but Drawers Clothing will actually go ahead on to become DC, the famous brand that Rob Dyrdek himself made famous, basically. Rob realized that skaters would wear nice and comfortable shoes outside of skating, but when it came to skating, they only had a limited selection of small, uncomfortable shoes. And throughout his partnership with DC, they let him design a shoe, and Rob Dyrdek created the very first comfortable skating shoe. He decided to call them the Dyrdek Ones. The shoe would go on to sell extremely well, and Dyrdek would end up making $300,000 that year from just selling shoes. But you see, at this point, Rob Dyrdek was 21, an extremely successful 21-year-old, yet he wasn't considered the best skater or a popular skater at all. So you could say Rob Dyrdek was a great, young, successful businessman, but he wasn't winning skating competitions, and he overall wasn't successful at, well, doing the very thing he does for a living, skating. So he focused on bringing his vision to life and proceeded to release the Street Dream video series, which captured the attentions of people worldwide. But Dyrdek still wasn't there with the top skaters at the time, like Tony Hawk. So naturally, as you do when you're very successful at something, you tend to focus more on that thing than anything else. So Rob Dyrdek slowly started focusing more in the business aspect of skating, but also off skating. He started all kinds of business. The man started hip hop labels, shoes, TV shows, skating leagues. Oh, and did I mention TV shows? Well, Rob had gone so far away from skating that at one point, DC told him that they had thought he had peaked as a skater, and they just wanted him to come over as a shoe designer instead of sponsoring him, essentially canceling his upcoming sponsorship, offering him a full-time job. This moment is when Rob realized that not even his own team believed in him, and that's how far he had gone away from skating. Therefore, he started to shine on the skateboard again because he already had the money to build his own skate park. And this is the very first fantasy factory where he would skate every single day and practice every single day in his own private place. Therefore, when he got to competitions, Rob Dyrdek would constantly be placed in the top 10 skaters and in the podium. So much so that DC Shoes decided to keep him. However, they still offered him that job as a shoe designer. Well, here is where the genius of Rob Dyrdek actually starts shining. He made a slight counter offer to them saying, I'm gonna design as many shoes as I can, and you can keep the ones you like and pay me 2% for those, and you can just throw away the ones you don't like, and that would be that. Dyrdek did get a lot of shoes rejected, but of the ones that they did keep, he would make 2% off the sale. At the time, a shoe would sell for about $60, and a 2% royalty on the shoe would be $1.20 per shoe. One time, DC's catalog had 35 shoes of Dyrdek's. DC never actually released statements of how many shoes Dyrdek sold, but estimating Dyrdek was probably making either high 6 figures or even 7 figures. DC would decide to make a skating video named the DC skating video. I know, back in the day people weren't that creative at all, but you didn't really need to be because they had some of the best skaters out there to be filming in this video. However, Rob Dyrdek wasn't one of those. See, Rob was featured in the video because he was probably the most popular figure, but he wasn't the most skilled skater at the time that they had. In fact, he was probably the least skilled skater that they had. So Dyrdek, again, started thinking and found out a way to still stand out, even if he wasn't gonna be having the best tricks. So Dyrdek came up with a concept where he would get kicked out of skate parks and would eventually get fed up that he would hire his own personal security would come and stop them. And it was just hilarious to see at the time how the security guards were pretending to be badasses, and as soon as they saw this tall, huge guy, they would go all soft and stop bothering Dyrdek. And here is where Big Black comes in. Rob literally went to the first security company he could find, which was City Events in Pacific Beach. He asked for the biggest, tallest, meanest looking guy, but also he asked for the friendliest guy. Immediately, the hiring person had someone in mind. This created a super funny dynamic where security guards would try to kick Rob Dyrdek out, but they would be so intimidated by this huge guy who would show up and scare away the security guards, tackling them a lot of the times. And it was just a hilarious kid that was so relatable for all other skateboarders out there at the time that were getting kicked out of parks. And it obviously helped that Big Black was super charismatic. They didn't know this at the time, but this would be a friendship that would last a lifetime. At this time, I do want to point out Big Black had his own security company that was doing fairly well, so he was definitely not leeching of Rob Dyrdek at the time just for the money. However, it obviously benefited both of them. DC would see how contagious this energy was and would get them invited into the Gumbo 3000. Due to the fact of how hilarious they were, Ruben Fletcher wanted to put a camera in the car and film the experience inside of the car, which would end up eventually being extremely funny, and it would eventually make the hands of Jeff Tremaine. Jeff Tremaine had worked in the creation of Big Brother, Jackass, and Wild Boys. At first, Ruben tried to pitch the idea to Big Black and Rob Dyrdek and told them that they should do a TV show, but Dyrdek and Big Black didn't find themselves interested in the idea. So Ruben Fletcher went straight up to Jeff Tremaine and told him, hey, look at this tape. Wouldn't it be hilarious if this was a TV show? To which Jeff Tremaine went, why didn't I think of it before? Let's do it. So eventually Rob Black got convinced by MTV and Jeff Tremaine to make a show. Because naturally, Rob is not one to pass on opportunities. And it's almost like they knew what it was gonna happen. MTV was really close to messing it up, offering Rob Dyrdek a show that was called The 12 Rules to Success from Dyrdek, which one of the rules was having a big guy next to you, and that's where Big Black would come in. MTV also wanted this to be 100% scripted, which at the time is what was the most popular in MTV. While the filming of the pilot episode happened, Big Black said he could outrun Dyrdek in a foot race. He went off script. That had been the most hilarious skit of the entire episode. At that point, MTV gave up and decided to give Rob and Black a non-scripted TV show, which wasn't common at all at the time. This would be the first time you would see MTV giving some creative control to Rob Dyrdek. And boy, would this become a theme in the future. Rob Dyrdek, realizing now that he was gonna have a show on TV, he wanted to make sure that he was taking less money up front and taking more money in royalties, in case that if his show takes off and it becomes a hit, then he'll make more money on royalties. You see, Rob wasn't the first person to get an MTV show that was a skateboarder. In fact, Bar Margera had Viva La Bam airing on TV at this time. And Bam was so popular that he was selling 3 times the skateboards and merch than Tony Hawk. So this is when Rob decided that he would restructure all his deals and get a percentage out of them and less upfront. Rob's entrepreneurial spirit and charisma led him to create the groundbreaking reality show of Rob and Big, featuring the larger-than-life Christopher Big Black Boykin. The show being an immediate success. You see, they would just do a random skit where Rob would come up with a crazy idea and then Big Black would just go with whatever was suggested, making them hilarious. And the show just got so popular from hilarious skits every single episode. Whether it was kick flipping an alligator, buying a mini horse and dressing it up to be a friend of its dog, dressing up as ladies, trying to time travel, or starting an R&B group, every single episode was just good TV and it was perfect for the time, captivating audiences with its unique blend of humor, skateboarding, and heartwarming moments. And with this new platform, Rob went from being a well-known skateboarder to a full-blown mainstream star. He would end up getting a 10% royalty with DC Shoes. And DC as a whole went from an $80 million company to a $400 million company in just a few years, where Dyrdek was just literally showing and showcasing the brand everywhere he went. MTV was paying $35,000 per episode, and in the last season, they were paying $60,000 per episode, which would eventually sum up to a total of $1.4 million after all 3 seasons. The baller lifestyle that Dyrdek had manifested in his younger years, he was now 100% living it in reality. Unfortunately, behind the scenes, not everything was as great as it seemed. After the first and the second season, Big Black wasn't having as much fun as he was having before. They were filming 13-hour days for months on end. Also, Big didn't like that Rob was getting paid double than he was. Dyrdek says that this is not true, but also Dyrdek was writing the skits, helping with promotion, and working 24/7 for every single idea that was executed on TV. What I'm trying to say is, I don't know if it's true and I don't think we'll ever find out. However, I wouldn't be surprised if Dyrdek was getting paid more than Big Black. Because admittedly, Big Black would just show up, bring the funny, and leave. And Dyrdek was a 24-hour hustle machine. Eventually, the show would get canceled when Rob and Black had a falling out and argued over every single idea in the show. This was never made public, and they quietly would go on without speaking to each other for a long time. However, MTV was desperate for a season 4, and MTV had offered $125,000 per episode. But you see, there's a trick to that. There were 2 options. One was $125 per episode for Rob and Black. But Big Black decided he was done with Hollywood, so they had to go with option number 2. Rob would have to start a new show with one caveat. This show would have to be a reality show, which again, it was something that was extremely popular in MTV at the time. Rob said that he never wanted to be the old guy on TV, and at this time he was 34 years old and he wasn't too happy with being on TV at this age. However, ratings weren't doing great and people wanted to see him out there, and MTV wanted to have him. So again, Rob not being one to pass up on opportunities, he decided to take the deal. Dyrdek pitched Fantasy Factory, who would take place right then and there, and he also pitched at this time Ridiculousness, which would eventually be the only thing that MTV would show for 3 days in a row on a regular basis. But we will eventually get there. Here is where the genius of Dyrdek strikes again. See, he accepted to the deal, but he had a slight stipulation on the deal. And that is that in this case, he would have the integration rights to whatever was shown on his TV show. In case you guys don't know, integration rights is every single brand that you see on a TV show, it was paid to be there. So Dyrdek would initially have the opportunity to negotiate this integration rights for his TV show and make 100% profit of those. However, partnerships that came in through MTV, Dyrdek would go 50-50 with MTV. You see, Rob had a lot of benefits, but also MTV had a lot of benefits because they could just sit back and relax because they had nothing to do in their end either. Funny thing is, Dyrdek used this deal so he was making to show on their TV show, but he would add stipulations to this deals as well with this brands to advertise with their other companies, whether it was Wild Grinders, Street Leagues, or his own very line of street skateboarding parks. And you see, Fantasy Factory basically became this show where he would promote his own brands that he wanted to bring in on MTV's time, and he wasn't only not paying for it, but he was getting paid $100,000 per episode to do it, on top of whatever he was bringing in integration rights. When Fantasy Factory debuted, it was an absolute hit. Rob essentially became a stuntman for his own show in one half of the factory, and in the other half of the factory, he had his personal enterprise. He essentially made Fantasy Factory his own private production house. Rob promoted numerous products in his new show. The bigger ones were Wild Grinders and Street League Skateboarding. Wild Grinders would go on to get a show in Nickelodeon, and Street League Skating would go on to become arguably the best professional skateboarding league out there. In 2011, Big Black comes back, this time to Fantasy Factory. Beef had been squashed and the ratings doubled after Big Black showed up again. Essentially running all the same stunts that Rob and Black had done already, keeping the same style show, but this time in Fantasy Factory. This wasn't the only Rob Dyrdek show that was making massive numbers in ratings, because at this time Ridiculousness debuted to 3 million people, the biggest number that they would draw. This basically was America's Funniest Home Videos, but they would bring a celebrity in every single episode and they would have Rob Dyrdek react to the videos. In fact, when it comes to money making, Rob Dyrdek made a lot more money from Ridiculousness because he didn't have to spend that much to put the show on. And Dyrdek was getting paid $140,000 per episode. After years of being extremely successful, Rob was ready to retire and he didn't want any more Fantasy Factory. He wanted no more Ridiculousness. He wanted no more TV. He just wanted to be done. But once again, MTV begged him to stay. MTV didn't have any big shows at the time, but Fantasy Factory and Ridiculousness were the only shows that they had that were drawing good ratings. So Rob did all the creative writing he would have for brand integrations and even some production. How could MTV let someone go that had been on top for so long? But Dyrdek didn't want to be 40 years old on TV. Dyrdek said that he wasn't making any money on Fantasy Factory at the time because keeping the factory costed $5 million every single year. And Dyrdek saying that the only way he would go back with Fantasy Factory is that if he was offered so much money, it would be stupid not to do so. They didn't want him to walk away from Ridiculousness because the show was a powerhouse 24/7. It didn't matter at what time you're showing it, people would just stay and watch the show. Even if the premieres didn't do great numbers, you could just put the show on at whatever time it was and people would watch it. Probably because it's a 2 a.m. show, you don't have to have any brain capacity to focus on. It's a perfect show because you don't have to follow a storyline. It doesn't matter what episode you're watching. And Rob, again, knowing MTV was at its mercy, organized one big deal for the last season of Fantasy Factory and 140 episodes of Ridiculousness. which would take him all the way to season 10 in 2017, which at the time was said to be the biggest financial move of his entire career, because Rob would bring in his own production company, Super Jacket. They would produce the final season of Fantasy Factory and Ridiculousness. So now MTV wouldn't even have to produce the shows. They're not filming it, they're not editing it. Essentially, it was like their own little YouTube. Here's my video, go and upload it out there, put it on your screen. At this point, it is assumed that he had ownership in the show as well. Dyrdek and Big Black got through the final season of Fantasy Factory, even though they didn't really want to go through it. And eventually the ratings weren't as good, but it didn't matter. They just wanted to be done with it. Unfortunately, 2 years later, we got the sad news that Big Black had passed from a heart attack in Plano, Texas. He is survived by his 14-year-old daughter. At this point in 2017, Ridiculousness was only really premiering to around 300,000 people, compared to 2012, where it was 3 million people. However, people still loved it. Whatever time you put it on, they would just watch it. At this point, Dyrdek had already gone over being the old guy on TV. This time, MTV was at an all-time low, and Dyrdek renewed for another 250 episodes. At this point, outside of Ridiculousness, he's going full-on entrepreneur mode, growing a whiskey company, street league skating, technology, snack brands, protein shakes, and is still being shown on TV 60% of the time in this multi-billion-dollar network. And in 2020, Rob made the new biggest financial move of his life, selling Super Jacket, who had been producing the last season of Fantasy Factory and 7 years of Ridiculousness. There was another stipulation in this deal, which was 301 Sports Entertainment had to buy Street League along with it, getting him $150 million in this deal. You see, Super Jacket and SLS were companies that Dyrdek built while being paid by MTV. But not only he was getting a salary, he was promoting these companies in the show, and at the same time getting paid for the show he was putting on and promoting the companies, but also getting paid to the companies that were helping the show. You see, it's such a tangled web. The only way of explaining it is that Rob Dyrdek was a genius and used MTV to promote himself. MTV got their benefit out of it for sure, but Dyrdek definitely got the most out of it. You see, MTV weren't investors, they weren't partners, they were simply the platform where Dyrdek showed all his things. Dyrdek has now renewed a contract for 250 more episodes of Ridiculousness, after which, once again, he probably would be good to be done and walk away forever from MTV. If Rob's salary of $140,000 per episode stayed the same, which we doubt it did, throughout the 819 episodes he's done of Ridiculousness to date, he would have $114,666,000 just as a salary for hosting Ridiculousness, not including any of his other brand deals. Now Dyrdek is a completely different man from where he was young. Now he's a calm, zen, cool, and collected father and entrepreneur that just keeps thinking of ways to become a billionaire. And it all came from having a multi-billion-dollar company at his mercy for 15 years. If you guys like more content like this, please check out this Mike Tyson video. It's my most liked video I've put out yet. See you in the next video. See ya.
It's all on the coat, ballin' now, skirt down, all of these diamonds so bottom for me, but they're yours now. You could drink it, but take it slow. Ballin' for you, fallin' for